All right, so good afternoon, everyone. So I know that some people are still on a Zoom meeting and they may join us a bit late. It's still ongoing, a lot of study. So thank you for being here. So my name is Amandine Prat. A lot of you know me because I teach here in MRC and also in the audio lab this semester. So it's very, very great to see a mix of students and a mix of faculty in the same room. It's pretty rare, so that's awesome. And I know that a lot of people on Zoom as well, so thank you for joining. Very cool. So I'm here today to present with my colleague, Professor Jude Broughton, who is an acoustician, has been teaching for quite a long time in this school, more than 20 years, if I'm not wrong, and has been teaching in the audio lab for a while and now in the School of Arts and Technologies. And I'm also here with Katie Ambrose, who is a PhD student here. And Katie has completed 2 MAs here, so one in music production and one in vocal studies.
Yeah, solo voice ensembles, I mean.
All right, yeah, the SVES. Yeah. So yeah, very interdisciplinary today, and thank you very much, Sam, for helping us setting up this conference. All right, so I'm delighted to coin the term female ear at this conference. I mean, we have done it before, but let's say we're coining the term in the UK. That's the first time. As an alternative praxis to teach and to research the science and cultures of music production and audio engineering. So we are going to provide you audio mentors, educators, practitioners, musicians, composers, etc., designers, with approaches to challenge normative recording making conventions and obsolete psychoacoustic knowledge. So let's see if that works. We should when I because okay, got it. So I will introduce the practice, echoing applications of the feminist theory of the female gaze in art criticism and film studies. Then Jude will underline interconnections between data gaps in audio perception and representation gaps in music production. And Katie will walk you through the methods and findings of a case study that we carried out here with female identifying students in the MA and artists who we invited to collaborate with us at the University of York last year to question typical sound criteria and recordist attitude that are commonly conveyed in audio schools. Finally, we will propose analytic and research directions that we hope to discuss with you during the Q&A. And have a look at the time, so try to not be too long. All right, so let's start with the gaze theory. That is coming from psychoanalysis approaches by Freud and Lacan. I don't know if some of you are familiar with the concept a little bit. Right, great. All right, so I'm not an expert of these theories, but my understanding of the gaze theory is that we become aware of the existence of different gazes by being conscious about how others observe us and how we adapt to these observations. So through this process, we realize that the image of oneself has been filled in by others who we may want to emulate, such as role models or love objects, and those who are, of course, impacted by social biases and meritocracy systems. This mirror effect generates an intimate relationship between our gaze and our desire. If you know a little bit about Lacanian concept, you have most likely heard about the objet petit a. That implies that we desire what we don't have, what we lack. You may also have heard about the concept, the woman does not exist, it's even more famous, that is used by psychoanalysis to explain to heterosexual men that when they project their fantasies on women, they consider them as objects and not as subjects. So if you wonder why this concept is expressed in a sexist way and in a very binary, essentialist way, that is because woman objects are normalized in the media, a phenomenon designed by the male gaze. So do you follow me so far? Yeah, it looks much better than at the Audio Engineering Society, I have to say, where people were like, kind of.
Oh, we carried on though, we carried on.
Oh, that's good. That's good. So in 1972, British art critic John Berger applied the gaze theory to take a somewhat artistic approach to the way in which women can be and are being represented in art in general. From his essay, Ways of Seeing, I quote, a woman must continually watch herself. She is almost continually accompanied by her own image of herself. While she is walking across a room or while she is weeping at the death of her father, she can scarcely avoid envisaging herself walking or weeping, end quote. Yeah, I'm sorry, you can't read it. So this is like the beginning of it in the arts. Just 3 years later, British feminist film theorist Laura Mulvey broadened Berger's application of the gaze theory to propose an alternative approach to study the grammar and structure of films through the lenses and desires of a female identifying spectator, character, and narrator-director. So in her foundational paper, in which she defined these 3 looks of gaze, the character, the spectator, and the narrator, she stated, playing on the tension between film as controlling at the dimension of time through editing and narrative, and film as controlling the dimension of space through changes in distance and editing, cinematic codes create a gaze, a word, and an object. Still following? All right. So similarly to most important feminist publications that happen in the world, this paper has been highly criticized, mostly because of its essentialist and binary definition of gender. Nevertheless, this paper from the 70s has opened a door to deconstruct the hegemony of the male gaze in cinema and also in other fields, without blocking in any way its extension to a more inclusive definition of gender identities and to the analytic framework of intersectionality that acknowledge how a person's various social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. So just as an example, because there are a lot of different gazes that have been written about, but the queer film theorists have recently established the queer gaze to offer us as viewers the opportunity to grasp at the possibility of queerness in film, even where it is not explicitly shown, functioning as an alternative reading practice that queer audiences can employ beyond the medium of film. While we do not pretend to define the praxis of the queer ear in our paper and in our talk, we invite you to read the paper of our colleagues Liam Maloney and Alice Masterson about Prince's cancelled album Camille, engineered by Suzanne Rogers, as it might be a good example of queer ear production. And I just watched this last night, and it's quite good. Just a little recommendation. All right, so now to help you to grasp the relationship between the hegemony of the male gaze in society and male-dominated industries, impact standards, and so-called best practices, I go back to Mulvey's foundational paper in which she demonstrated how the male gaze is embedded in cinema standards through the overuse of scopophilia, which refers to an aesthetic pleasure involved in looking at other people's bodies as objects without being seen ever by those on screen or by other members of the audience, right? Which is most of Hollywood cinemas, if you think about it, most of TV that we still watch today. So this is illustrated on the slide by a series of 3 shots from Hitchcock's Psycho, highlighting the split between the active male subject and the passive female object that is normalized through the use of shot and editing techniques in the grammar and structure of classical Hollywood film. Yes, I think everybody has seen that movie. It's like still a good example. Like, there will be a day where the students are going to be, I have no idea what you're talking about. All right. Okay. Yeah, and I'm feeling bad that you don't see this, so I'm just going to make sure you see it. So to define a female ear, I draw upon the work of feminist film theorist, and I echo Iris Bray, who conducted her thesis on the female gaze in film, and who stated, the female gaze, or the female ear, is a conscious gesture. It does produce engaged and politicized pictures or sounds. The female gaze or ear is not mere coincidence, it is a way of thinking. So what does it imply in audio engineering? It can imply, for example, manipulating loudness in a critical way, challenging the goal of reaching for a big, hard, smack-in-your-face sound, as we can read on audio blogs, forums, and sponsored content to sell dynamic range compressors, all the internet. Yes, all right. And I'm sure you're going to hear other things, right? I just had to put that one in. Okay, so I listed here key principles of the female gaze that I have translated to the female ear in my teaching, my research practice. One is giving visibility to the artistic and technical contributions of female identifying directors, producers, and engineers. Deconstructing standards to embrace diverse aesthetic pleasures, which leads to diversifying audiences. Representing a range of social identities to provide role models and love objects for everyone, including in singing and all of it. Enabling more than one interpretation of a scenario and of the musical discourse of a mix. And this is probably the one that I'm most attached to when I teach mixing, for example, right? Don't make it too obvious. We're sick of hearing things that are so obvious, right? So like try to underline different things, you know, and give us different understanding of what you want to do. So challenging white heteropatriarchal orders, provoking thoughts about social biases and inequalities is, of course, part of the process. And I don't know if you're familiar with Alice Guy, but she has directed about 100 movies. So she was French and she lived in Paris in the early 19th century, 20th century, sorry, and late 19th century, and started her own company and reach a certain limit, as you can imagine, and so moved to New York, where she continued doing that. And she has, for example, don't know if she has invented it, but she has used the close-up shots as part of the grammar of the film in a way that has been taken on and used. And when you read, it's more in the paper, but when you read about the history of film, you find out a lot of women have discovered things that are used still today, like such as using a boom to get the film sound or things like that. So it's pretty impressive when you see that they represent less than 1% of film directors for quite a long time in the history of film. Okay, so some notes. So more details again are provided in our paper about these key principles with examples that support the following notes. But we want to remind you that the female gaze and the female ear can be applied to all directors, producers, engineers, and theorists, regardless of their gender. So it's very important. Actually, many women directors and engineers, producers, and theorists apply a male gaze and a male ear to their work, most likely unconsciously. Also, a queer gaze has been established to study what is suggested, but not explicitly shown in film, and we invite you to define the queer ear similarly. So I will now give the microphone, as we have a lot of microphones here, to Jude, who will show you another aspect of the female ear and explain why it is important to pay attention to it if you want to be scientifically accurate when teaching practices or conducting research in music production and audio engineering.
Thank you, Amandine. So I'm going to be controversial and say everything we know about audio is wrong, or indeed everything we know about spatial audio. I'll put spatial in brackets, that's my area of research expertise. With a caveat, at least it could be, because we don't actually know, because we're dealing with a data gap. Inspired by this amazing book by Caroline Criado Perez. If you haven't read it, it's available in the library as an ebook and a few hard copies, which I think last time I looked were all lent out, but go and get it, go and read it. It's absolutely amazing. And she, as it says on the front cover, exposed data bias in a world designed for men. And a really striking quote early on in the book. Imagine a world where your phone is too big for your hand. Your doctor prescribes a drug that is wrong for your body. Or in a car accident, you are 47% more likely to be seriously injured. So we had to remind ourselves just this afternoon, Katie and Amandine, the first female crash test dummy. So that's the dummies that are used in engineering, automotive engineering, to discover what will happen to a human being if they were in a crash of some kind. The first female and anatomically correct, physiologically correct dummy was on the market in 2022. That's not very many years ago, is it? I expanded this quote, I'll tell Caroline later. Or imagine a world where the fancy binaural immersive audio that you've paid extra money for every month via subscription just doesn't work for you. You put your headphones on, you're expecting some amazing immersive audio experience, and it just sounds a bit like big stereo. which you don't have to pay for. Okay, so you've got the idea. You know, if this is familiar, chances are you're a woman. So inspired by Caroline Criado-Perez's book, we wanted to investigate a little bit whether is everything we know about audio wrong? Does audio suffer from a data gap? Perez describes this problem as the data on human beings is overwhelmingly based on data from only 1/2 of the population. So again, we've got that binary divide, men and women, but bear with it because she does explain more in the book as well. And it's hugely detrimentally impactful on women's health, work, and lives. So specifically, a data gap can be defined as a gap in our knowledge that is at the root of perpetual systemic discrimination against women, so it's a gender data gap, and that has created a pervasive but invisible bias with a profound effect on women's lives. Now, hands up, I've worked in audio for many years, and I didn't even think about this for very many of those 10, 15 years. It's an invisible bias because it's sort of so pervasive, it's baked in, we don't notice it's there. So here's just a few examples of where the gender data gap plays out in our world. In terms of heart attacks, women are 60% more likely to be misdiagnosed because the very sort of common traditional way of understanding somebody having a heart attack, got pain down one arm and they're sort of clutching their chest, that has been generated from data from overwhelmingly male patients. Women have different symptoms when they're having a heart attack. Car accidents, I mentioned the female crash test dummy. As well, so I won't go into that. Office temperature, I mean, this one strikes a chord with me. I'm always too cold. Generally, you know, a survey around the world, office air conditioning is set as 5 degrees centigrade, too cold for women. So we know that men and women respond to temperature differently, but generally, you know, office temperatures are set for men and not for women. And this one is more audio related, isn't it? Voice technology. So voice technology that abounds at the moment, 70% more likely to recognize a male voice. And sometimes that's about the pitch of the spoken voice, but it's often about the data that voice technology recognition software has been trained on. And we don't go into AI explicitly in this talk, but we have to remember that a lot of the data that's being collected and a lot of the analyses that are being done are now feeding into AI algorithms that are going to rule the world in a few years' time, apparently. So we need to be careful. In 2018, I was privileged to contribute to a study led by Kat Young and others in the audio lab at the University of York over the lake in the engineering and physics department. We looked at the gender of authors who were presenting papers, workshops, roundtables, etc., in audio engineering society conventions over a time period, 2012 to 2019. So we collected all the data there that we could on authorship. We worked up a new method of establishing people's gender. It's not always obvious from their names. Sometimes we can jump to conclusions about somebody's gender from their names. Where it wasn't clear, where we weren't 100% certain, we would get in touch with those authors and ask them. So we were reasonably confident that we haven't misgendered anybody in our database. The stats, I think I've got them on the next page, okay, are quite, I was going to say shocking, but they're probably not shocking because they're not surprising, because we sort of, we see this all around us. If you've ever been to an audio engineering society conference or convention, it's sort of obvious, you know, what sort of people are there and the lack of diversity, especially in terms of gender, but other diversity issues as well. So out of 206 papers in that database, 174, that's over 80%, were written by either a sole male author or a group of authors who were exclusively male. Only 20 papers were written by a mixed gender group of authors, and only 12 papers were written by a sole female author. So there's a gender gap in terms of the people analysing, researching, writing, formulating the audio engineering science around the discipline of audio and audio engineering. But more recently, we've started to look at, can you see that? Can I move that out of the way? Don't suppose it matters. No, I'll leave it. I'll talk it through. I'll talk it through.
Open the chat and close it, which will make it disappear. Chat. Yeah, and then close it. Oh, open it.
Thank you. So we wanted to look at, you know, where's the gender data gap within audio engineering itself, within the science, within the research that we know. So we looked at a state-of-the-art paper. So this is a multi-authored paper, and I'm pretty sure they're all male authors, so they would fit in that previous category. 2030, spatial sound with loudspeakers and its perception, a review of the current state. So this is a state-of-the-art paper. This is everything we know in 2013 about spatial audio. Okay, I know it was 10 years ago, but I'm sure we'd see similar results if we did the same thing today. All of the references in this paper, we looked at them, where they mentioned a listening test or some sort of perceptual test, so some test that involved human beings, listening to things, giving subjective opinions or measuring some sort of objective measurement of acuity, but where human beings were involved rather than just sort of physics and mathematics on a blackboard. There were 150 papers cited where participants were involved. And 150 papers cited in that overall paper, only 33 included human participants. In nearly half of these, the gender of the participants is not stated, which is interesting in itself. If you think about medical research nowadays, that idea of diverse patient groups being involved in that research and replicability as well. If you don't know the demographic, socioeconomic, gender, et cetera, makeup of the participants involved in your test, then somebody's going to really struggle to replicate your results. 7 papers did note all male participants. So 7 papers out of those 33 papers only had male participants. We can discuss. And 10 papers involved a mixed participant group, but not always 50-50 gender balance, sometimes 10% female. That seems good enough to us. It's interesting to note that there were absolutely no papers cited in this review paper where only female participants were involved in testing. So if we crunch the numbers a little more, no, I can't make it work. That one, thank you. This means that in that review paper, over 500 test participants have contributed their data towards studies that are mentioned in this review paper, out of which only 48, that's less than 10%, are known to be female. We can make a wild guess that where the gender of participants isn't stated, they're actually male. And why do we know this? We know from our own colleagues and ourselves, and I've been guilty, hands up, I confess. You know, you're running a test, you've got a paper deadline looming, you need some more people to run the test. Who are the first people you go to? The students, the colleagues in your building, and they tend to be in schools of physics, schools of audio engineering, schools of music technology, and they tend to be overwhelmingly male. So that's something we can all do better, I think. But that figure of less than 10% that we know are female, you know, just given what Amandeed's been saying about the female ear, the female gaze, there's this massive data gap, gender data gap within audio engineering itself. One of our students shared this with us. I think, are they online? Hi, Aid. Thanks for passing this on. It's really, really useful. So Andrew Sheps, if you don't know him, he's one of the most famous audio engineers from the 1990s. That's the last century. Oh my goodness. He was audio engineer for Metallica. And I think he's sort of doing an informal Q&A at a convention here. And I'd like to play this clip. It's a couple of minutes long, but I think it's worth hearing in full from one of the people in the business. Fingers crossed the sound works.
You can't overstate using a personalized HRTF. So head-related transfer function, it's the thing that defines how your head is shaped as the sound, like if it's coming from here, it hits this ear at this angle, this ear a bit later at this angle. Everybody's head and ear and inner ear are totally different. And it's the pinna here that directs the sound into the ear canal that is crazy different on everyone's ear and is the most important part of it. And so they have apps. Dolby has an app. I'm not sure, Odyssey might have an app. There are apps to do one just based on video, and they're not perfect, but they're way better than the standard one. That's like, okay, that's supposed to work pretty well for everybody, but think about it. I mean, that's insane. And it works better for white males than anyone else on the planet. Now that's weird, isn't it? It's because it was done as an average of a lot of white men. And there have only been 2 of them in the history of HRTFs. There was one in the 60s, and I think they updated it in the 80s with like a few more people. So definitely use the apps to give yourself a personalized HRTF, and you should be able to externalize a lot better.
Okay, so HRTFs, head-related transfer functions, are a mainstay of how binaural spatial audio is delivered over headphones. And as Andrew says there, you know, just look around the room. Like everybody's head is a different shape, everybody's ears are a different shape, everybody's ear canal a different shape and size, just completely different. And what he's talking about there when he says, you know, they made one in the 1960s, they made one in the 1980s, is the head and torso mannequin that is very often used in audio engineering departments to measure and model HRTFs, the standard HRTFs. Now, the one that was designed in the 1960s, when you look into the archive, you realize that even though people in the industry will say that this is an average human, and you dig into the archives and the papers of the conference at that time, where the head and torso mannequins was launched. I feel like I'm on the BBC. I'm not saying the brand name. I'm not going to say the brand name. No, I won't. No, you can do it later. Where they had a whole conference to launch this new amazing mannequin. Fantastic. And you dig into the paper and you see that the physiological measurements were based on 500 airfighter pilots from the USA between the ages of 18 and 25. Think to yourselves how demographically representative fighter pilots from the 1950s, aged between 18 and 25 in the USA, may have been in terms of gender, race, disability, height even. I don't think you got to be a pilot if you were my height, for example, you would be able to see out the cockpit. So, you know, but then they probably thought, oh, we need a few women in as well. So they had like 35 women who worked in the canteen. And then they did something weird with the stats, where they took like a median of both of those groups and then took the average of the median. So if there are any stats nerds in the room, you want to have a talk about that. Kat, if you're online, let's have a talk about taking the mean of 2 medians. That would be interesting. So it's not an average human. When you look at it, it doesn't look female. I mean, it doesn't look human. Anyway, so we can talk about that. This isn't all despair, but it's just to illustrate how Perez says we don't notice a gender data gap because it's invisible, because it's pervasive, and because it's just sort of the default. You just go along, it doesn't hit you in the face so much until something goes wrong. Until you put on your headphones expecting that spatial audio, immersive, amazing audio experience, it doesn't sound right. Until we realize that this is inherent in the audio industry as well, this gender data gap. It isn't all doom and gloom. There are people working to try and fill some of these data gaps. So this is a project led by my colleague in the audio lab, again over in engineering, on collecting head-related transfer functions for binaural audio from a much wider variety of people, a much more diverse user group. We can do this because the technology is advancing at a pace. It's getting much more simple, much more quicker, less invasive to measure HRTFs. And Andrew Sheps on the video actually talks about apps where you can use photogrammetry, you can take photos, 3D photos, and sort of extrapolate from there. So there, the future is looking more hopeful, but it's interesting to me that we've got such a big gender data gap baked into audio engineering science, which has this sort of symbiotic relationship with audio industry and the music production industry, both in terms of who's involved, who's giving their data, who's giving their responses to perceptual tests, who's leading on the science that feeds into the media that we make and the music that we make that is delivered by that media. So that's why potentially, that's one reason why there is such a huge gender imbalance within the music industry itself as well. So there's a few stats just on the board. It's not just gender, it's also about race and ethnicity and about social and economic background as well. There's just every area in the music industry just seems to be biased. I can't remember what the next slide. More stats. Men outnumber women and non-binary tech creators by 19-1. I'll hand over to Katie, who's going to take us through a case study. I think we're actually going to hear from some women as well, hopefully. Not just Andrew Sheps.
It's an highlight. You want it.
So as part of this exploratory study, which in turn was part of the Engaging with Research module in the MA in Music Production here at the University of York, we conducted 3 discussions with female identifying music professionals. When this project with the ultimate aim of coining the term the female ear was first conceived, we initially considered conducting interviews with music practitioners who identify as female. However, following a discussion between me and Amandine, we proposed to the group of MA students that were involved in the project that we might want to consider doing discussion groups instead, rather than interviews. We proposed that this would create a space for all involved, including the research team, to express their thoughts and ideas on the project, ultimately ensuring that nobody was othered in the process. And I think we felt that part of the responsibility of conducting research through a feminist lens is challenging norms and precedents that have been set previously as standardized ways of researching, and proposing ideas for methodologies that may well ensure that every single voice is represented. So, we acknowledged, though, that if we did not have any key talking points to guide us through these conversations that the questions normally would provide for you in an interview, there was a risk that these discussions would end up with going in rather different directions, particularly because they were being led by different members of the research team. Therefore, we came up with 6 concepts that would lead these conversations. And each of these concepts were to come with its own definition, which were drafted by me and then were rewritten by the research team in a group meeting. This was to ensure that everybody in the team had the same understanding of each concept and that there was a clear and easy way to initially present each topic of conversation. So these 6 topics were as follows. It was loudness, spectrum, depth, complexity of the musical discourse, which acts as an alternative in this practice to the visibility of the musical discourse, sound signature, and then sound minds. Each discussion included at least one person who could draw on their expertise as a sound recordist, and at least one person who could draw on their expertise as a performer. Initially, these discussions were going to be between one member of the research team who would take on the role of sound engineer and one music practitioner taking on the role of whatever it was that they did as their profession, so producer, performer, or composer. However, Amandine and I acknowledged that if whoever was taking on the role of sound engineer was not wholly comfortable in the role, that it would perhaps be more beneficial to have slightly larger focus groups to ensure that perhaps even more space was allowed for organic conversation, and that there was always definitely going to be one steady hand on the tiller for each discussion. So for the first of these discussions was led by the 4 female identifying Chinese students from the MA, who spoke to Eva Blanche, who is a French-American pop singer-songwriter, and Marjolaine Charbin, who is a French London-based performer of experimental music. Next, I had a conversation with Italian London-based classical music producer Isabella de Sabata, who has nearly 40 years of experience, and experimental and voice and opera artist Loré Lixenberg. And finally, Amandine talked to York-based DIY punk bassist Joe Dale. Out of the 7 musicians that we approached to take part, 5 of them could find time to take part within our short time frame. The study methods were designed between the 4 MA students, Amandine and myself, and this included the co-creation of the list of sound criteria with recordist attitudes that would be used in these discussions. And everything on the list was given its own definition to ensure that everyone had the same understanding. The discussions ran with an introduction, allowing everyone in the space to present themselves with their own words. And then a member of the research team leading the discussion presented each definition, allowing space in the time that followed for everybody to reflect on their own experience. The key to success in these discussions was to ensure that essentialist attitudes were avoided. The idea was to talk about your personal experience and response to each concept. Our discussion guide opened with a sound criteria of loudness and spectrum, which used to illustrate the aesthetic values of colours and noises in the reproduction of the human voice. Loudness implies loud, and so influences the level of intensity applies to a mix or a master, and spectrum contains the frequency that the voice and other sound sources occupy and their perceived colours and affordances. African-American live engineer scholar Whitney Slayton denounces the ideological and technical preference for sonic intelligibility and transparency that leads sound engineers to eliminate uneven resonances or colorations in all phenomenal sounds, acoustic environments, and hearing capabilities, as well as the culturally constructed expectations for listening to these sounds in live or recorded popular music. This suggests that sound engineers make decisions according to their straight white male ear as the universally accepted reference in the field. Bjork explains that women need to be louder and sharper, more aggressive in timbre than normative femininity permits in order to be heard in popular music. However, this can be challenging for those who experience the feminine fear of loudness that can be regarded as a fear of disrupting the dominant gender socioacoustic order in Western society in general and in popular music soundscapes in particular. This also carries the risk of invoking the shrill and strident fishwife stereotype. By using the lower end of their voice, women can reduce the threat of being silenced, but that prevents them from cutting through the mix or conversation in a noisy workplace, so e.g. in a rehearsal space, a stage, or a recording studio. The next 2 sound criteria bring value to depth as the created 3D virtual space within the sound image and the complexity of the musical discourse that is based on how differently we appreciate the layers and colours of a track each time we listen to it. These criteria moderate the dominance of loudness and spectrum and have the potential to rebalance priorities when it comes to manipulating sounds in the recording studio. Finally, we propose the typical recordist attitudes are perpetuated in audio programs, namely by imposing a sound signature and embracing either a traditionalist or technophiliac sound mind as elucidated by Bennett. Here we define the sound signature of a producer, engineer, label, or recording culture as the sonic specificities that delimit a sound territory, which may be imposed on music performances mediated by technology, consciously or unconsciously. In every discussion, one or more of the participants observed that the term loudness is misleading, as the term itself purports high volume, whereas our defined criterion refers to relative levels and within a mix. So I'm going to just try and play a short clip of Isabella discussing that. See if
I mean, I find that loud really, I mean, I have never really thought about it until now, but loud is a relative concept completely. And it's like hot or cold. It, you know, something could be cold, but feel hot because you're touching something colder. Expressively, I think volume is a function of what comes before and after, not the decibel levels.
Apologies for my interjections of agreement with her in the background. There were multiple references from participants discussing how compression is often applied in post-production, and that the use of compression can directly oppose this expressive function of the creative volume or the level within the space. It also recognised that this applied compression risks losing the colours and frequencies found in the sound that the musicians take their time to cultivate. Jo Dale talked in detail about searching for the right rich sound in her instrument, which was seemingly constrained for years by the constructed belief that this was a sound colour palette that only solid wood bases could create. This belief limits who can create a specific sound, because as due to her body structure and height, she found it difficult to play a full-size bass that was also made of solid wood. And she just talked about how it was only recently that she'd found that she could actually perform on a 3/4 size electric bass that was made of solid wood and be able to replicate this sound that she'd been told for years that she couldn't actually make. This perceived gendering of instruments is even more prominent when you're relating to the human voice, as the instrument in question is entwined within the body of the practitioner. Eva Blanche talked about her experiences working as a professional singer, where her colleagues encouraged her to stay on that soprano thing, even though as an artist, she wanted to explore all the frequencies and colours that her voice has to offer. And so I've just got a little clip of her talking about that as well.
It's the others that I was working with that I saw were trying to push me towards, oh yeah, stay on that really soprano thing because you can do that. And, you know, and that sounds great. And so that can let me do this, you know what I mean? It's kind of, so it's afterwards that I realized that. But for me, it's just staying experimental. And I hope I can always stay like that and make it work, but still always stay in constant research to never think like that or be blocked by that.
And that's Marjolaine this time inserting her affirmative responses to what Eva was saying. This described experience is distinctly reminiscent of the circumstances that led PJ Harvey to release a 4-track demo version of Rid of Me to show to her fans how Steve Albini had compromised her specific sound by overprocessing her vocals. These preconceived constructions permeate through the way in which sound recordists and music producers have taught methods for mixing. As Amandine recounted in her discussions with Jo Dale, she was told at school that you had to put the bass in the middle and don't question it. If one chooses to push against these expectations, it is possible that a mix can be perceived differently by different people, and perhaps even differently by the same person on another occasion. So my final clip for you is just a bit of Loré talking about that exact thing.
I mean, in a way, that's the beauty of it, because it's so abstracted that actually nobody can tell you how to listen. They can try, even you can try, but you will listen to what you're listening to, and that's it, I think. But then also, one can only speak for oneself, I suppose, because we don't know what it's like to be in someone else's ear.
Again, apologies for me. I promise I said more than yes in this discussion group. So many of the participants spoke about the need for everyone in the recording session to be involved in defining the sound for a project, as this allows multiple voices to shape the end result. This should naturally lead to a complex mix with several layers of understanding, simply because it stops one person's opinion and taste from dictating the entire sound. This attitude towards sound creation also mitigates against any form of othering in the co-creation of recorded music. By delimiting the sound territory, we ensure that we can no longer be owned by, the sound can no longer be owned by just one person. There was discussion about how the concept of a sound signature is taught as part of the sound recorder's or producer's education, and that without this, the prospective practitioner will not be able to make a name for themselves in the field. By considering the voices of all the people involved in the project, this sound signature can be seen to apply specifically to a project rather than to a particular set of musicians, sound recordists, or producers. This attitude towards sound creation also mitigates from any form of othering. I've already said that. Excellent. The fetishization of technical gear, alongside the tendency to use jargon, can be exclusionary when speaking to those who have had access to specific knowledge required to be able to access this technology. And Joe was talking about it and saying that it's like medical terminology, isn't it? It's a different language, and it's a very technical language that people outside of that language do not understand. This use of technical language in this way can give the user a status of power, as it allows them to hold knowledge over this elusive gear and only share this language with other people who are in the know. Several of the participants spoke about situations where they have felt that it has been assumed that they simply cannot have this technical knowledge based purely on the gender that they present. They felt that they had to prove that their knowledge to their male counterparts in a way that they had to prove their knowledge in a way that their male counterparts have not. Marjolaine recalled her experiences studying to be a sound recordist, saying that she was pushed out of the profession because it was so sexist. It was horrendous. She went on to say she could feel that there was just no room for her, and that she would walk into a studio and she could hear sexist comments being made the moment that she walked in. Working towards diffusing these stereotypes and prejudice about knowledge that practitioners hold or do not hold should facilitate all listeners, performers, composers, and sound recordists to work freely and creatively without restriction imposed by presented gender. So in my continued work towards my doctoral thesis, not doing well with words today, I'm exploring how the female gaze and ear can influence and inform the intersection between technology and gender in choral performance spaces by investigating the representation of men, women, and non-binary people in visual and audio recordings. We include this slide here because it was from a presentation made by one of the MA students in the Joint Student Symposium on June 7th last year. This slide highlights in the own voices of the MA students why they thought it was important to begin formalising this practice. They applied the female ear to their final research projects, inspired by the hope that this work could catalyse new approaches to make music, allowing us to think outside the box, fight stereotypes, and to promote equitable treatments for everyone in the creative industries that involve audio and music technologies. One notable example of the final research project that was inspired by this was Max Deng's project that was titled The Female Gaze Behind Music Scenes, which looked at how the music of even extremely popular female identifying artists was considered to be experimental. We will be continuing to analyse materials that have been regularly used to teach skills such as mixing and mastering and other post-production techniques. And this will include a continued survey of the tests and data that have been used to drive the development of such techniques, to analyse who has been included in such studies, and to assess how information is being presented and what questions, or how questions are being asked and what questions are being asked. And that's, I think,